Hi everybody. Every time I give you reading assignments outside of textbook chapters, I'm going to provide you with a little intro to the readings video. They're all going to be narrated PowerPoints unless I build up the wherewithal to turn my camera on. But since reading is part of a conversation, the writing is one side of the conversation, reading is the other, I want to make sure that you're prepared going into the reading assignments for your half of the conversation. So for each of these intro to the readings, I'll give you some background information in terms of the author and the piece that I'm asking you to read, as well as some prompts, things to think about before you actually start reading, things to pay attention to while you're reading, and then things to think about after you've read the piece. So this is the first one. It covers the two readings, The Chase by Annie Dillard and In Too Deep by Dillard Ruprecht. So the first reading is The Chase by Annie Dillard. She is an American author. She was born in 1945. She is incredibly prolific. This particular piece comes from a collection of essays that she wrote called An American Childhood. So it's important to place this in the framework of her childhood. Being born in 1945, she was a child in the late 40s and early to mid 50s. This particular essay that I'm having you read, you'll notice as you read, she says she was 7. So it takes place in 1952. So we have to think a little bit about what childhood was like in 1952 America. First, children were still viewed as they should be seen and not heard. Children were really the responsibility, child rearing was really the responsibility of the mother. There was, if you ever watched old TV shows like Leave It to Beaver, mom was home taking care of the kids. That was her responsibility. Dad worked. When he came home, he may have contact with the kids, but it tended to be rather minimal. And the contact did then tend to be focused on boys, sons, as opposed to father-daughter relationships. So we know that Annie is a little girl during this story. We should also remember that in that time period, childhood was rather gendered. Boys were encouraged to play outside. This is about the time where the phrase boys will be boys came into being, and boys were sort of expected to have this, rough and ready, rough and tumble play and personalities and, not necessarily do everything by the book. Whereas girls, when they were encouraged to play outside, it was very sort of docile things. Girls were not really allowed to wear pants at that point in time, or let alone jeans. So you have to picture little girls in dresses playing outside. The outdoor games for girls really consisted of things like hopscotch, jumping rope, playing jacks, and pushing a doll in a stroller. And that was really about it. So that helps set the framework for the story that Dillard is going to share with us. But before you start reading, I want you to think about your own childhood. What memories stand out to you? Why do they stand out to you? Was your childhood particularly different from what childhood would have been like in the United States during the early 50s? Were you told that you could only do certain things because you were a boy, or you could only do certain things because you were a girl? What were the expectations that you felt as a kid? Then as you're reading, I want you to really pay attention to how she describes things. At the beginning, she talks about this idea of rules and children. Is that accurate? She describes the other kids that she's playing with. Remember that, early 1950s childhood was incredibly gendered, so this is important, the other kids that she's playing with. And then as she tells us about the events, how the events play out, pay attention to the descriptions. It's important for us to go into reading this also remembering, or knowing rather, knowing would be the better word here, that memory is not 100% accurate. We remember things the way we want to remember them. And our memory is rather protective. And what I mean by that is our brains pick and choose our memories and focus on certain things. And frequently our brain will shut off memories that are incredibly negative. But it will also take memories and change them so that they better suit us at the time we are remembering them. So in some instances, we remember things from the past much more fondly than they actually were. But we also can remember things as being worse than they actually were. A good example of this is when you think back to experiences as a kid, places that you went, and then you revisit those places when you're older. Places that seemed very big aren't really that big. Things that seemed really impressive aren't necessarily that impressive. But your memory still will hold them the way that your brain has decided is important to you. So the way she describes these events, the other kids, the idea of rules, we need to keep in mind that those memories, because she's writing about this so much later, might not be 100% accurate. And then once you're done reading, I want you to think about why this particular memory, even if it is not accurate, has become so important for her. We experience thousands, millions of things over the course of our lives. We don't focus our memories on every single one of them. We hold certain memories for a reason. So why do you think this particular memory has become so important for her? And then for the second reading, which is In Too Deep by Tom Ruprecht, we've got some other things related to memory going on. But first, a little bit about Ruprecht. He is a writer. He has done a lot of writing for film and television. He is known for writing several episodes of How I Met Your Mother. He was a writer for the David Letterman Show. He's written some screenplays. And this particular essay he wrote, and it was published in the New York Times. So he has, as we know from his writing for television and screenplays, he writes humorous content. So that's important to keep in mind. And then, excuse me, before you start reading, I want you to think about what it means to you to be cool. How would you define cool? What type of people do you think are cool? Do you think you're cool? Why? That's a good basis of things to think about before you start reading in too deep. And then as you're reading, pay attention to the things that Ruprecht feels the need to tell us. He picks particular things to talk about. He talks about the tour guide. Why does he use the words he chooses to use to describe the tour guide? What does that tell us about the tour guide? What does that tell us about Ruprecht? When he encounters Ernie, how does he describe Ernie? Is he do you think he's being accurate? As he tells this story, because we know he writes humor, do you think that as he's telling us this story, that he is being 100% accurate, factual, or do you think he's playing with things in order for us to think they're funny? And then after you read, do you think Ruprecht is cool? What kind of person do you think he is? What does this story tell us about him as a person? Is he the kind of guy you'd like to hang out with at a party? Or is he the kind of guy that you would go, hey, I need to go get a drink. I'll be right back. And then you just head off in the opposite direction for the rest of the party. It's, who knows? I think it depends on our own perceptions of cool, our own perceptions on and reactions to the story that Ruprecht tells. So now that you've got some food for thought, go and read the essays. They're in the folder here, the reading folder. One is a link to a PDF online, and that's the Chase. And then In Too Deep is a PDF right in Blackboard. So read both of them, think about them, and then you can move on to the discussion and reflection.